Oi pessoal, tudo bem? Eu sou o João, bem-vindos a mais um vídeo aqui no canal. Nesse especial de Halloween, nós vamos fazer o top 10 dos monstros dos desenhos clássicos do Scooby-Doo. Mas, antes de começar o vídeo, eu quero pedir para vocês já se inscrever no canal agora, e ativar o sininho para você não perder nenhum vídeo, e deixar o like e deixar aqui nos comentários qual é o seu monstro preferido. Agora vamos para o top 10. Número 10, monstro. O Creeper é o disfarce do Sr. Carl Sewell, presidente de um banco. Número 9. Fantasma de Central. O Fantasma de Central era o disfarce de a Volt, o negociante de arte oriental e líder de uma quadrilha internacional de contrabando. Seus dois capangas também estavam disfarçados de zumbis de Central. Eles faziam isso para afugentar as pessoas curiosas sobre o templo postiça assombrado que servia de base para sua organização de contrabando.
While in San Francisco to celebrate the Chinese New Year, Daphne makes an impulse buy that, what else, gets her kidnapped, leading to the gang disrupting an international smuggling ring in Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
Okay, try to wrap your head around this. Chinese art dealer Mr. Fong was the head of a smuggling cartel where each month he would be sent a jeweled mask reproduction which would be hiding a tape recording containing the details of their incoming illegal shipments, which would then be transcribed to smaller pieces of paper to be sent to the rest of their gang by carrier pigeon. Carrier pigeons. In 1970. I know this was long before the internet and cell phones, but wow. At the time, landline telephones, CB radios, and secret codes existed. If Mr. Fong was afraid of having their communications intercepted by law enforcement, there's even a thing called a courier who could have gone around the country personally delivering instructions.
The more they overthink the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain.
As Mr. Scott so eloquently explained, the more complicated you make a scheme, the easier it becomes for it to unravel. In Mr. Fong's case, all it took was one wrong delivery in his Columbia House Mask of the Month Club for the entire operation to fall apart. He probably should have used UPS for his deliveries rather than the local post office in Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
The supernatural aspect of this caper was little more than the bad guys dressing up in vaguely spooky outfits to discourage snoopers and didn't really play much part in anything. I'm giving their design a 2.5 out of 5. Smuggling is lucrative, but there had to have been a less convoluted way of going about it. To frighten people away from their Chinese temple hideout, Mr. Fong's henchmen wore ghost masks that didn't appear to be inspired by anything traditionally Chinese. At the beginning of the episode, Fong himself wore robes that hid his face, but was nothing inherently supernatural. It wasn't until they kidnapped Daphne and stole the Zen 12 mask that he wore the full disguise, implying it was a last-minute idea on his part. I don't understand why the gang were scared by the henchmen initially. Remember, they were only there in the first place to watch the Chinese New Year festivities, so shouldn't they have assumed the henchmen were wearing costumes for the celebration? After all, Shaggy and Scooby weren't hiding in fear from the dragon, prominently displayed in the parade. But then again, being surrounded by happy festival goers is a lot different than being accosted by two large men on an empty street in Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
None of the disguises were that impressive and featured no special effects that would make them look like anything other than three guys wearing robes. 1 out of 5. Say it with me. Kidnapping is the worst thing you can do to scare off meddling kids. Though a high-speed chase through the surprisingly deserted streets of San Francisco is also a poor way to maintain a low profile. I mentioned before how needlessly complicated Mr. Fong's smuggling ring was, and we saw in the episode how easily it failed. However, it was successful enough that despite suspecting Mr. Fong as the mastermind, the authorities had been unable to secure any evidence to arrest him until the gang got involved.
I do know the mystery. The golden mask was stolen many centuries ago from the crypt of the great warlord Zen Tuo.
Right here, Mr. Fong would have saved himself a lot of hassle and probably his entire smuggling ring had he simply taken that moment to remove the evidence that he was involved. While holding the mask, it would have been very easy to excuse himself from the room, saying something like, "I'll be right back, I need to get my magnifying glasses," and while out of sight, pop open the secret compartment, take out the tape, then return to the gang and say literally anything that would get them to leave. This is a reproduction of the grave mask of the warlord Zen Tuo. It's a nice tourist piece, but not worth that much money. I have no idea why those men tried to take it from you. It was probably just a petty street crime. Chinatown is very big, so I doubt you'll see them again. Have a nice day. Then all Mr. Fong would have to do is order his henchmen to leave Daphne alone. Done. No more clues for the gang to follow. They would have nothing to lead them to the smuggler's temple hideout. Scooby and the rest would eventually go home with no more than a vague unease about the attempted mugging. But hey, it's Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
A further mistake in claiming the mask was genuine is that Mr. Fong seemed to have forgotten that he had been operating under the guise of being a legitimate art dealer. This means if someone brought him what was supposed to have been a stolen cultural artifact, wouldn't he have been duty-bound to immediately contact the authorities, and if the gang refused to stick around until investigators arrived, detain them? That's the difference between being a respectable art collector and a common thief. Obviously, he couldn't afford to have the fake mask wind up in the hands of the police, so perhaps that was why Mr. Fong felt it was smarter to let Daphne keep it until his henchmen could steal it later. But this only makes it worse that he claimed it was a legitimate piece in the first place and didn't take the recording when he had the chance.
Don't you know it's illegal to shoot off fireworks and wreck a storeroom?
We will build a new storeroom.
Mr. Fong's decision to kill Shaggy and Scooby using a pile of fireworks is also highly questionable. He dismisses their legitimate observation about destroying the storeroom by glibly telling them he'd build a new one, which is not a bad Bond villain type line, but if the whole point of the masks and kidnapping Daphne and trapping Fred and Velma was to protect their secret hideout, wouldn't setting off a large explosion defeat the purpose? Certainly fireworks were already being set off during the New Year celebration, but those were one or two at a time, not a massive pile that would result in major damage to a building in a populated area. The temple in the hills isn't in the middle of nowhere. They're still in the city. You can see buildings in the background. Somebody is going to report hearing an explosion. Or maybe not. After all, it's Chinatown.
It's Chinatown.
For forgetting his cover as an art dealer, making the fundamental mistake in drawing the gang to their hideout by kidnapping Daphne, and choosing a way to kill Shaggy and Scooby in the most attention-grabbing way possible, Mr. Fong and his gang get a 2 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves him with a do score of 1.8 out of 5.
Perhaps you would be interested in this golden mask.
No thanks. Clown faces are more my bag.
Clown faces are more my bag. What? I'm no auto mechanic, but if your tires are bald enough to skid on a banana peel, it's probably time to look into replacing them.
A bibs for the boo boys. Mustn't get dirty, you know. Here's the specialty of the house. Chocolate chop suey and spare ribber a la mode. If you want anything else, just go...
Jesus Christ, Hanna-Barbera!
It's Chinatown.
Número 8. Fantasma espacial. O fantasma espacial era o disfarce de Harry Bascom. Número 7. Fantasma de Barba Vermelha. O fantasma de Barba Vermelha é o disfarce ser Maningus, o dono de uma linha de navios a vapor falida. Número 6. Zumbi. O zumbi é a ultisfaces check. Ele age com servo tablu chat ultisfaces sepekins.
Returning from an unsuccessful fishing trip, the gang still managed to hook themselves a mystery after stopping to ask a lantern-holding zombie for directions. Zeke and Zeb were a couple of armored car hijackers who, years earlier, sank their heisted vehicle in the swamp to, presumably, wait until the heat died down. Unfortunately for them, they forgot where exactly in the swamp they left the car, so they were forced to resort to chasing others away while they searched the waters. This is why pirates draw maps. Their choice for scaring potential busybodies was to dress up as a witch and her zombie companion. Given the swamp setting, wrecked riverboat, and alligators, it's a safe assumption that this episode is likely set in Louisiana, so a witch, zombie, and their voodoo doll props are appropriate. However, from a storytelling standpoint, the fact that there were 2 monsters and only 2 non-Scooby Gang characters limited the suspect pool for any would-be detectives following along in the audience. Zeke and Zeb were fugitives, having already committed their main crime of stealing the armored car, so their scheme to scare people away from the swamp could be considered necessary. While we never saw anyone else, it's understood that the small town of Swamp's End was deserted due to all the residents having left in fear. And as the owner of what appears to be the only general store in the area, Zeke was also in a good position to warn any new visitors to leave as quickly as possible.
Huh? Yep, Zeb and me are the only ones left, and he's so scared he won't leave his cabin.
That's shoplifting. You see, this is what I'm talking about. You keep your dog on a leash when you're away from home. We don't know exactly how long the armored car had been missing, other than the sheriff's vague mention of after all these years. This allowed Zeke and Zeb plenty of time to come up with the witch and zombie cover story, and judging by how empty the town was, it was a successful plan until the gang stuck their noses in. Ultimately, though, it's still just another run-of-the-mill hidden treasure Scooby episode, unique only in that the treasure was put there by the forgetful villains themselves. So we'll give it a 2.5 out of 5 for design.
Like there must be $1 million in there.
So that's it. Those creeps were after this money.
Well then, let's give it to them. Huh?
For having spent several years at the bottom of a swamp, that armored car is surprisingly clean. As previously implied, the southern swamp setting may have led Zeke and Zeb to naturally take advantage of possible local legends and superstitions by disguising themselves as a witch and her zombie summon. Dressing up as a mummy wouldn't make that much sense, and frankly, dealing with wet linen in a hot, humid locale would be a nightmare. By this point in pop culture, witches had been popular for decades, and it's clear which one inspired Zeb the first time he sat down in the makeup chair. So, not much originality there. Zeke Zombie, on the other hand, was still relatively fresh. Well, as fresh as a rotting corpse could be considered.
Come forth from the flame!
They just recycled a close-up of the zombie from his earlier appearance. He's still holding the lantern. These days, of course, zombies have been around in film and television for so long that we've had to come up with new ways to depict them just to keep audiences awake. But back in 1969, when this episode first aired, the zombie depiction on everyone's mind had to have been the kind featured in George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, the slow-moving, reanimated corpse. However, faster, more dangerous zombies had also been a thing, especially in the golden age of comics before the Comics Code came to take the fun out of everything. Zeke's zombie had the best of both worlds, the slow-moving, shambling corpse when trying to intimidate, and the fast-moving one when chasing the gang. While neither costume featured or needed any special effects, as witches don't glow and zombies aren't transparent, Zeb still managed to up his supernatural game by including floating effects by way of a disguised helium balloon and magic effects by way of smoke bombs.
Zeke the witch could appear and vanish as if by magic behind a cover of smoke. Watch.
Tiny smoke bombs, which also, somehow, managed to create sound effects. Neither the witch nor the zombie were original monsters by this point, though both do manage to play a prominent role in the Scooby-Doo Renaissance 30 years later. The disguises were appropriate for the location, and considering the town was already deserted when the gang arrived, clearly effective at being scary enough to frighten people away from their homes. For children who grew up watching the annual television airing of The Wizard of Oz, the witch had to have been frightening, and the zombie makeup with the red eyes and bat-like ears probably gave more than a few kids in the audience some bad dreams. Zeke and Zeb get a 3.5 out of 5 for their costumes. Before the gang stumbled upon their scheme, Zeke and Zeb had already successfully driven everyone out of the area. When the mystery machine arrived at Zeke's store after encountering the zombie, he told the teen sleuths the cover story he and his partner were using, not knowing that trying to scare away the Scooby Gang from a mystery by telling them a spooky story is like trying to scare Andy Dick away from your teenage son by throwing bags of cocaine at him. By the way, Zeke himself was the zombie that the gang had just encountered. So how did he make it to his store in time to greet them? He had been on foot, standing by the side of the road while they were in the mystery machine. He likely had his pull boat nearby, but he still wouldn't have been able to go faster than a van.
And ever since then, no one's ever dared to go into the swamp.
The fact that the zombie ends up being Zeke himself means this dissolve was a surprisingly cinematic choice to be made in terms of foreshadowing. Most Scooby-Doo series aren't celebrated for their artistic merit, so it's only fair to point it out when it happens. As to be expected, the gang ignored Zeke's warning and started their usual meddling, forcing the criminals to take further action to discourage the teenagers. And by action, I mean stupidly kidnap Daphne again.
So that's how it works. Yeah, but then what happened to Daphne?
That's quite a drop through the trap door. Daphne's lucky not to have ended up with a couple of broken legs. As I've said before, kidnapping one of their friends is the worst thing you can do when trying to chase people away. It's even worse in this situation because Zeke and Zeb ended up leaving a trail of footprints that led the gang directly to their riverboat hideout. Hindsight is 20/20, and Zeke and Zeb could be forgiven for assuming what worked so well against the residents of Swamp's End would naturally work for any visitors to the area. But had they simply left things at Zeke's warning about the witch and zombie, let the teenagers check out Zeb's cabin, and held off on their search for the sunken armored car until those teenagers left, things would have undoubtedly gone better for them. Speaking of Zeb's cabin, what was the point of the voodoo doll? Zeke told the gang that Zeb was too frightened to leave his home, so if anyone visited the shack and found Zeb missing, would they just assume that his fear of the witch and zombie led him to simply abandon the town like everyone else? By leaving the voodoo doll there, it directly implicated the witch in Zeb's disappearance. Surely those two were clearly overthinking their scheme.
Don't call me Shirley.
Further evidence of this is how they were still dressing up as the witch and zombie while searching for their loot. Anyone who had been living in Swamp's End had left by that point. So why didn't Zeke and Zeb simply look for the armored car openly as themselves? If anyone did happen to drive by and were nosy enough to accost them, they could have just said they were looking for a good place to hunt for frogs. As is typical of many Scooby villains, the duo ended up messing up an otherwise successful scheme by leaving more evidence of their supernatural shenanigans than necessary, not appreciating that sometimes less is more. 3.5 out of 5 for the operation. Their final due score is 3.2 out of 5. Oh, thank God. I thought it was going to be Scrappy for a moment.
Número 5. Palhaço Fantasma. O palhaço fantasma era o disfarce de Harry, o hipnotizador, que jurou vingança contra o ciclo do Sr. Paddington depois que este o mandou para a prisão por roubo. Número 4. Fantasma de Alice Kingston. O fantasma de Alice Kingston era o disfarce de Stuart Wenstep.
While visiting a friend, the gang become embroiled in a haunting involving the ghost of Elias Kingston, an apparition with a unique method of punishing its victims. In What the Heck's Going On? I love that title. Greedy Uncle Stuart decides to forego the usual difficulties involved with inheritance law, like estate attorneys and probate court, by dressing up as the ghost of a rich dead guy, as well as another full disguise as one of the rich dead guy's victims, to scare his niece and her father away from the family fortune. This is another example of the Scooby writers relying on the naivete of their presumed younger audience, who would likely not understand that a family fortune is generally comprised of real estate holdings, stock portfolios, high-dollar pieces of art, and savings and retirement accounts scattered throughout any number of financial institutions. Unless your last name is Teach, it's unlikely that your family's accumulated wealth would conveniently fit inside a single locked chest. Of course, the writers for an animated show that aired the same year that the Beatles recorded their final studio album would have no idea that adults would still be discussing their work decades later, and can be forgiven for such a childlike depiction of a wealthy family's resources. If we take it for granted that enough of the Weatherby family's money could be concentrated into an easily transportable container like what's seen here, and presumably filled with cash, gold coins, and other liquid assets, Uncle Stuart's scheme is a decent one. But was it worth the risk of getting caught? If the rest of the family learns he tried cheating them out of their inheritance, forget the small prison sentence he might get for his crime, they'd probably end up going to court to remove Uncle Stuart from all the wills and trust accounts. The episode doesn't establish if Uncle Stuart is Sharon's paternal or maternal uncle, though. If he's a Weatherby, he likely has some claim on the estate and was just impatient to get his hands on it. But if he's simply a brother-in-law sponging off his wife's rich family, the desperation he shows, which includes kidnapping his own niece when she sees through one of his disguises, is understandable. Perhaps he lost a lot at the track, and his bookie is starting to make demands. Without a clearer understanding of Uncle Stuart's motivation for his crime, like gambling debts or an impending tax audit, just being greedy doesn't seem like a good enough reason for him to take such a large risk. This earns him a 2.5 out of 5 for the design of his plan. This is one of those moments I've noticed in Scooby-Doo when you wonder, who exactly is the villain doing this for? Uncle Stuart is the bad guy pretending to be under the power of the ghost he invented, but as far as he knew, there was no one else around. I understand if he's acting the part in case his niece or her father see him, or perhaps he even wants them to follow him into the old Kingston mansion. Oh hey, that place looks familiar. But that's kind of dangerous. Uncle Stuart looks like a sleepwalker here, and surely most people, if they saw an older family member walking away in an obviously impaired state, would immediately investigate, probably stopping him before he has a chance to apply his old age makeup. Speaking of which, this is a rare doubleheader for a Scooby episode, where the villain wears the disguise of the ghost and one of his victims. The Elias Kingston costume is adequate and reasonably creepy, but not exactly frightening. There are no special effects on the outfit itself. It doesn't glow, it's not transparent, it doesn't fly, and apart from one scene with a floating table that gets exposed immediately, the only direct supernatural moment takes place in a fake flashback. The most impressive thing about the Kingston disguise is how Uncle Stuart was able to hide a full beard under the makeup. Cesar Romero would have been impressed. The aged version of Uncle Stuart, though, was actually impressive. He does a good enough job that it easily fools two of his closest relatives. Granted, this disguise would have immediately fallen apart under the most cursory of medical examinations, but there's no danger of that because Uncle Stuart's family doesn't even think for a moment to call an ambulance for a loved one who, as far as they knew, was clearly the victim of a life-altering trauma. Uncle Stuart's actions don't look quite so bad if this is the kind of uncaring family he was trying to swindle. Granted, he doesn't stay in the old age makeup too long before the final stage of his victim disguise, where he's nothing more than a mummified skeleton. I'd give the relatively tame Kingston's ghost disguise a 2 out of 5, and the impressive elderly Uncle Stuart makeup a 4 out of 5, bringing the average of the two costumes to a 3 out of 5.
I think we found him, only he looks a little older now.
Wow! I guess that ghost wasn't kidding.
By the way, who drew this skeleton? Because there's no way that artist ever saw a real one in their entire life, or their only reference material was a book on ancient Mayan archaeology. Being two places at once is inconvenient, which is probably why Uncle Stuart brought out the skeleton so quickly. He might have also been setting the stage for faking his own death so he could live elsewhere under a new identity with his stolen fortune. However, this was risky because while artificial skeletons used for film and television look good on screen, except for that one, it becomes obvious under close examination that they're not real. Thus, assuming Uncle Stuart's plan was successful and he managed to scarf her off with his ill-gotten gains, once the authorities got involved in his death investigation, they'd immediately determined the skeleton was fake, and the missing man was likely still alive, and their number one suspect. Of course, Uncle Stuart had easy access to a mausoleum, so if he was determined enough to make a clean getaway, there's a good chance that those bones are real after all. In which case, Uncle Stuart is one of the more ruthless Scooby villains. Incidentally, if that deformed skeleton is one of your ancestors, you might want to make an appointment with a geneticist before having any kids. I mentioned earlier that Uncle Stuart's old age makeup was worth a 4 out of 5, but it would be remiss not to mention that at some point the wig apparently slipped off. This clued Sharon in that he wasn't actually an old man, which led to Uncle Stuart abducting her. By that point, his only crime had been trying to get his hands on the family fortune by pretending that a ghost had turned him ancient. No injuries, no real threats. If he had come clean to Sharon at that point, the worst that might have happened would be a fight in the family over the inheritance. But instead, he committed a felony by kidnapping his niece. Uncle Stuart also had a third identity, which we never saw, as a Swami. This is the first of 2 separate Scooby-Doo villain schemes in the first season alone that involves the bad guy using a fortune teller disguise to evade the police. Isn't there a better way for a swindler to disappear?
But where does the Swami come in? What better way for a swindler to disappear?
Apparently not. But as we see in both this and a later episode, a fortune teller disguise seems to make it easier to drop clues everywhere. In this case, it's a very specific book related to reading crystal balls. This was unfortunate for Uncle Stuart, as it immediately led the gang to his hideout. So why was that book there in the mausoleum and not back at his Swami shop? Did Uncle Stuart bring it with him to pass the time while waiting for the meddling kids to show up? If so, this would be the first time a Scooby villain was defeated for not having a smartphone to stave off boredom. I must also question Uncle Stuart's reaction when the gang discovered his hideout. All they had at that point was a book about reading crystal balls, which could technically have belonged to anyone. In fact, a decade or two later, it would probably be a bestseller from all the bored housewives hopping on the New Age bandwagon. While the gang did find a professional makeup kit and closed-circuit TV equipment, nothing in the shop actually linked the place to Uncle Stuart. If he had done nothing, the gang would have remained empty-handed, as the Kingston ghost had performed no supernatural acts in front of them that needed a scientific explanation. Hell, the one time he showed up to threaten them, he simply turned around and walked away. He didn't magically disappear. He didn't chase the gang until they gave him the slip. Presumably, he just walked out the nearest door. It wasn't until Uncle Stuart turned on the floating table and projected his face on the crystal ball did the connection get firmly established. Before that, all the gang would have determined was that the fortune teller was probably faking their powers. which is something that fortune tellers do. Because fortune telling is fake. Perhaps Uncle Stuart's biggest mistake was his timing. Why did he choose that weekend for his ghost shenanigans? Surely Sharon or her father mentioned that they were going to be having visitors. Was Uncle Stuart really that confident in his makeup that 4 or 5 more witnesses wouldn't be an issue? If he had simply waited until Shaggy and Scooby devoured the contents of the Weatherby fridge and then swarmed off like locusts to freeload on another one of the gang's many, many long-suffering friends and uncles, his plan may have gone off without a hitch. Or did he indeed have gambling debts that needed to be paid off before he got a trip to the cornfield? His impatience to postpone his plans, reluctance to cut his losses after Sharon discovered his lie, and his unthinking response to the gang snooping around his Swami shop earns Uncle Stuart a 1.5 out of 5 for the operation of his scheme. Averaged together, the Kingston Ghost gets a due score of 2.3 out of 5.
Why don't you go get the sheriff, Mr. Weatherby? We'll wait here.
We'll keep an eye on Uncle Stuart until you get back. And just to make sure nothing else happens, we'll all take turns standing guard.
Who's going to stand the first watch?
Who else? The watchdog.
How far away is the sheriff that the gang is discussing a rotation for a night watch? That's something you do when you're on a long journey through dangerous terrain, like taking the ring to Mount Doom, not waiting an hour or so for someone to drive to town and back. The sheriff isn't there by the end of the episode, though Sharon's dad mentions they're on their way. Here's hoping they don't get waylaid by the Black Riders.
As soon as we clean him up, I'm sure you'll recognize him. There. Look familiar?
Uncle Stuart!
Like in person.
Sharon was kidnapped because she discovered that Uncle Stuart had faked being old, so why does she sound so surprised to see that it was him under the Kingston makeup?
Número 3. Mineiro de 49. Mineiro de 49 era o disfarce de Hank.
Shaggy's stupidity results in the gang having to bunk down for the night at a guest ranch next to a deserted mining town where they run afoul of the ghost of a spooky prospector. The prospector ghost, dubbed the Miner 49er, was the creation of Hank, the caretaker for Big Ben's guest ranch, after discovering that his employer was sitting on a lucrative oil deposit and who wanted to scare off any guests to buy the land for cheap. A deserted mining town isn't exactly Las Vegas, so there couldn't have been that many guests for Hank to scare off in the first place, making his plot reasonably safe. But supposing that Hank had succeeded and Big Ben decided to sell off his failing business, surely the ranch owner would be suspicious that his old caretaker, who ran off the job in fear, would have returned to buy the land for himself. Granted, Hank could have set up a dummy corporation, but the fact that he couldn't afford to purchase the real estate at market value implies he couldn't afford a corporate attorney. And does this guy look savvy enough to navigate the complexity of the Secretary of State's office? Hank gets a 2.5 out of 5 for design. A prospector's ghost is reasonably original and does fit the setting of a ghost town. However, the costume itself could not have been that easy to manage, as stilt walking takes quite a bit of physical dexterity. Hank must have been a circus performer in his youth because he managed to not only balance so naturally on the stilts, but could also run convincingly. The originality takes a bit of a hit though when the disguise itself is just a fake beard and buying the contents of Gabby Hayes' estate sale earlier that year. Would it have killed you, Hank, to douse yourself with some baby powder or glow stick liquid? Mechanics of the costume aside, grizzled old men hanging around abandoned mines are creepy in and of themselves, so the supernatural angle is just the sprinkles on top of the Miner 49er donut, bumping this villain's outfit score to a 3.5 out of 5. Like many Scooby villains, the Miner 49er is tripped up by his own sloppiness. In addition to constantly popping up where the gang are investigating, Hank decided to hide an incriminating map inside a cigar store statue, despite the map easily being small enough to fit in his wallet. Worse, the map also included the combination to the lock hiding the mineshaft elevator, allowing the gang to uncover even more of Hank's scheme. Apparently, old people writing down their passwords originated long before the internet was created. It's also pretty embarrassing for any villain to get caught by what is essentially a gag you might see in an old Roadrunner cartoon. Beep, beep. I'm giving Hank a 1.5 out of 5 for the operation. The extra half point is acknowledging that old age comes to us all. This leaves the minor 49er with a do score of 2.5 out of 5.
But lately, he's been coming up here and scaring the guests away. And I'm going away in the morning myself.
During the scene when Hank is talking about the prospector haunting the old mine, Scooby sees an eye staring at them through a keyhole. That could not have been Hank, so it had to have been Big Ben doing the peeping. Girls, you might have something more to worry about than the minor 49er if the guy renting you your room likes secretly staring at his guests. Perhaps that's why Hank didn't trust hiding the map in his wallet if he knew that his boss was a creeper who didn't respect personal privacy.
Número 2. Fantasma do Capitão Clutter. O fantasma do Capitão Clutter era o suposto retorno do Capitão Clutter. Na realidade, ele fingiu a própria morte para poder roubar iates do aeroporto de Rock Point Beach. E número 1, Cavaleiro Negro. O Cavaleiro Negro é o disfarce do Sr. Wickles usado para assustar os visitantes do Museu do Contato durante o seu esquema da falsificação de arte. Então, esse foi o vídeo. Eu espero que vocês tenham gostado. Deixe os likes desse vídeo botão que tá aqui embaixo. E até os próximos vídeos. Obrigado por assistir. Felicidades, pessoal!